Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this WTO webinar on vaccines and critical goods, production, distribution, and trade policies. In this webinar, we have leading edge researchers who will present recent research on the topics of vaccine and critical goods production and distribution, intellectual property rights of critical goods, and trade policy related to critical goods. Each panelist has a 10 to a maximum of 15 minutes to present their work. After the presentations, the panelists hopefully will discuss key questions with each other. The audience can ask questions in the chat. So if you want to ask questions, please use the chat. And we've also put our 4 discussion questions that we provided to the presenters in the chat. Our panelists today, going first, will be Shebnem Kalemli-Ozkan. She's Neil Moskowitz Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of Maryland, and she's a member of the Economic Advisory Panel of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Our second speaker will be Patrick Golay, Associate Professor at the University of Bath, who has specialized in the economics of innovation. Our fourth speaker is Professor Arjun Jayadev, Professor of Economics at the School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. And then our fourth speaker will be Michael Creamer, University Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago, Director of the Development Innovation Lab, and probably useful information for most of you, 2019 Nobel Laureate in Economics. And then we'll close with Ms. Silvia Sorescu, Policy Analyst at OECD, working on trade facilitation, digital trade, and agricultural policies. So thank you all for joining us. Let's go right into the presentation. Shebnem, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this extremely interesting panel. And it's a privilege to be speaking at this panel with all my distinguished co-speakers. Let me share slides with you. Can you see them? Is it good?
Yeah. Yes,
okay.
Now we can see them.
So this is a very short presentation on our work on making the case, economic case for global vaccinations. It's joint work with my colleagues from Koç University. Just since I have 10 minutes, let me try to tell you briefly what we try to do to make the economic case for an equitable global vaccine distribution. We know that COVID-19 has caused catastrophe without sparing any country, and now vaccines are a game changer and can stop the pandemic in a given country. The point we are making in our research that helps us to make the economic case for global vaccinations on top of a moral case is the fact that we live in a globalized world. We are connected to each other with trade and finance. And that means until we solve the pandemic in every country, the countries who manage to vaccinate every single citizen is still going to suffer economically, okay? And our work estimates these economic costs. Specifically, we asked 3 questions. What is the economic impact of not vaccinating poor nations on rich nations? How much of the global cost the rich nations, such as United States, bear, even if they achieve universal vaccination in their own economies? And it looks like in the United States, we are going to achieve this in 2021. Which sectors in rich economies are going to be especially vulnerable? So the idea is the fact that COVID-19 is a shock that hits every sector, and sectors are linked to each other through global trade and production network. So what we would like to do in this research is to combine the sectoral heterogeneity in terms of epidemiology. We know that services sectors are hit harder because people get sicker there, because they work in close proximity to each other. And also we lower our demand for the services sectors because we don't want to go to restaurants. So we combine that type of heterogeneity comes from the disease with the sectoral heterogeneity in the global trade and production network, okay? So this is a picture of the model. So on the demand side, on the top, you have infection affecting consumer preferences. We have an epidemiological model combined with an economical model here. That is going to definitely affect domestic demand. You don't go to restaurants, but that's also important in terms of the foreign demand. If the foreign countries are sick, then you are not going to be able to sell your exports, right? So the recent news items, for example, that US now is going to recover and send exports because the rest of the world is also going to recover, may not be correct, because that's going to depend on the infection dynamics in the other countries. So this domestic and foreign demand for a given country's given sector's output is going to feed into equilibrium output on the top. On the bottom, the supply side, and our earlier work look at that, the demand side. And now this new work showing the economic cost of not vaccinating everyone focuses on the bottom part of this figure, on the supply side, where workers are going to be affected from the infection depending on their occupations. If they are in teleworkable occupations like we are doing right now, they might have a lower infection rate, but if they are working on site, they might have a higher infection rate depending on the physical proximity their job requires. And that's going to give you a labor supply shock. But this labor supply is going to be combined with domestic and foreign intermediate inputs in the production process, and that's going to give you the equilibrium demand. This is actually an extremely complex network, what we call global trade and production network. On the left in blue, you see the network countries. This is going to show the trade linkages between countries, both in terms of final goods and intermediate goods. And we are only showing like the large size trade relationships here. So you are not going to see many, many arrows because we are looking at trade over GDP more than 1%. And the sizes of the box are going to be the size of the countries. But you can see this is a very complex network. And then you have to embed the sectoral linkages, the figure on the right in the red, pink, orange color in this blue figure that gives you a very complex global trade and production network. And here the color coding is important because on the right, the sectors, some of the sectors are very tradable. They are going to be in red colors like coke and petroleum, but they are connected to domestic non-tradable sectors such as construction and wholesale retail. That's why in a country like United States on the left, and we put a solid border around the United States because that is a country that is going to be vaccinated in 2021. That country's sectors are still going to be hit when the other countries are not vaccinated because that country's sectors are going to be linked through final and intermediate good exports and imports to other countries, okay? And then basically we estimate these costs under two scenarios. What happens in terms of the effect of a health shock affecting labor supply and the intermediate inputs, both domestic and foreign, and then demand goes down, both domestic and foreign. First, we'll allow no amplification coming from international production network. This is IPN. And then we will allow full amplification through this picture that I showed you, working through inter-industry and inter-country input-output linkages, okay? And the way vaccine enters this framework is eliminating the labor supply shock and normalizes demand. So we estimate the worst case scenario, how much global and local amplification in terms of economic costs we can get from the health shock through this input-output linkages globally. And let me give you a couple numbers and I'm going to conclude. We run several scenarios. Basically, we look at scenarios where advanced economies have immediate full vaccination and emerging market and developing economies have no vaccination. Of course, emerging market and developed economies can respond to that by putting no lockdowns or endogenous lockdowns. So in our benchmark scenario, which is the last two columns here, where we assume full vaccination in countries like US, Europe, Japan, Canada, advanced economies by the mid-2021, by the summer 2021, and only half vaccinations in emerging market and developed economies at the end of 2021. And now we know that it's actually an optimistic case scenario. They are not going to be vaccinated till late in 2022. And we also assume emerging market and developing economies has to put lockdowns. In fact, this is happening right now, even in some European countries. And in that case, if we say, okay, the only thing you are going to use in terms of US, in terms of the rich country, that will be the export revenue, then the global cost is going to be 1.8 trillion and the advanced economy share is going to be almost 400 billion. So 21% of the global cost in this scenario is going to be borne out by advanced economies. If we will also allow amplification through international production network, meaning your imports of intermediate goods are also going to get hurt. And we started reading about this as car manufacturing stopped in US because we cannot get the chips. Then the global cost of not vaccinating emerging markets and developed economies is going to be 3.7, almost 4 trillion. And half of it, 49%, is going to be actually borne out by the rich countries, 49.3%. And these are not peanuts, right? These numbers, 21% of the cost borne by advanced economies versus 49% of the global cost borne by advanced economies, are around 1% to 3% of pre-pandemic GDP relative to pre-pandemic. And again, let me show you these in the maps. That the most hurt countries are going to be emerging market and developing economies, because they are the ones still sick. But rich countries are also going to be hurt. So here, if they only lost their export revenue for US, the cost is going to be around 135 billion. But when we add the global amplification through international trade and production network, now you see everything gets darker, everything gets orange in this map. Still, the most red, most hurt countries are emerging market and developed economies, but now the cost for US goes up to 600 billion, right? And overall, that cost is going to be around 2 trillion for all the advanced economies. So this is, again, makes the case that we have to vaccinate everyone, and this is just not a moral or ethical responsibility, but this is in the best interest, self-interest of advanced economies. And the final thing I would like to say is the sectoral losses, right? So what you see in this slide is two figures for one-digit sectors, losses plotted on the y-axis in percentage. And you see that on the right, if you're an unvaccinated emerging market and developed economy, you have very large losses. Your losses goes to 80% of GDP, especially you see the bottom sectors here, accommodation and food services, arts and entertainment. This is the typical story, right? Restaurants close, gyms close. This is when the pandemic is raging in your own country. What is interesting here is the left figure, the vaccinated advanced economies. So these countries assume vaccinated. That means they don't have a labor supply shock. They don't have sick workers. Their demand normalizes. And you see that now they don't have losses in sectors like accommodation and food, entertainment, and all that, right? Their losses are in the tradable sectors in blue, like manufacturing, agriculture, and fishing, but also in non-tradable sectors, color-coded pink, such as transport and storage and wholesale and retail. They are going to have losses as far as 15% of the output of that sector, shown here with blue diamond for the US and orange triangle for the Netherlands. So why? Because these sectors, as I showed you in the previous network figure, they are linked to other sectors that are buying their intermediate imports internationally. Let me stop here, and then I will discuss more with my co-panelists during the discussion. Thank you.
You're on mute.
Given how frequently I do this, you'd think I would not have made that mistake. Thank you, Shebnem. Excellent presentation, and I very much appreciate you staying on time. One question for you to think about is, you mentioned the trade channel spillovers. We also see very big stimulus in countries like the United States that we are observing spilling over into the trade channel and helping some of those developing countries. And if you might think about that in how that balance may trade off. They're not getting vaccines, but boy, they're getting some economic stimulation. But let's move on. Just think about that, maybe come back to it if there's time. Let's move to Patrick now. Patrick Golay. I think you're going to talk to us about R&D, and you're sharing your slides. Patrick, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me in the panel. Let me know if there's an issue with the slides or sound. So I'm going to split my time between talking about this recent paper with Rocher Agrawal at the IMF, and also offer a few thoughts on the third question for the panel, which was around intellectual property. So in that paper, Rocher and I were interested in understanding how special was the R&D response to fight COVID-19, and also where did this R&D response come from. So to answer this question, we need some kind of framework to think about the relationship, to think what a normal response would have been. And a framework, which is embedded in a formal model in the paper, is essentially that research effort should depend on market size. The bigger the market size, the more profitable it is for firms to do R&D in that sector. So we follow conventional models in that literature. So we need to measure these things. So to measure R&D effort, we use the number of new clinical trials. And because clinical trials have to be pre-registered, this is something we can observe almost in real time. Our measure of market size for all diseases except COVID-19 is essentially death burden with an adjustment for where these deaths occur. And for COVID-19, we estimate a market size corresponding to 10 times the realized COVID mortality worldwide so far. So it's by far the worst disease kind of in our sample. And in the paper, we have some sensitivity to different assumptions around that. So what we observe is historically, whereas looking at the cross-section of diseases, the elasticity of R&D effort with respect to market size is around 1/2. Suggesting that if you have two diseases and one is 4 times as bad as the other, it will only attract twice as much research effort. And this elasticity estimate, we find it in different specifications, also consistent with kind of prior literature on this relationship. Now, if we put COVID-19 in the picture, we actually find that COVID-19 has been a major outlier. There's been much more R&D than we would have expected based on the COVID-19 market size. In fact, we see maybe 10 times as much R&D as we would have expected. And this may come as a surprise to you because you may think, well, COVID-19 is this very big disease, which it is, and we assume that. I mean, that's reflected in our empirics. However, there is this pattern that I described earlier, this is what we call the law of diminishing efforts. When your disease will get worse, they don't get as much, the research effort doesn't scale up linearly. And that's how we get COVID-19 being this outlier. And then we're also interested in understanding how comes COVID-19 has been this outlier. And so we have been looking at where the R&D response come from. So first thing we looked at is, and I'll just keep giving it in a summary version. So first thing we looked at is it the case that R&D for other diseases went down, was crowded out because now there's this big focus on COVID-19? That's what we were expected going in. And in fact, we see only very limited crowding out for non-COVID disease. Instead, we observe an increase in the total number of clinical trials undertaken worldwide. Also, we find that public research institutions were a key driver of the COVID-19 R&D efforts. Together, the hospitals, universities, and so forth account for 70% of all COVID-19 clinical trials. And finally, we also compare the speed at which different vaccine candidates for COVID-19 progressed in the trials. We have more than 200 such vaccines in our data, and that comes from the WHO landscapes. And there we observe that controlling for the technology type, vaccines from the US and China progressed faster than those from Europe, possibly thanks to early incentives, for instance, in the US through Operation Warp Speed. So based on this, we think it could be that we may be able to scale up innovation for other diseases by replicating some of the things that seem to have worked for COVID-19, and that seem to involve complementing the market size effect with early stage incentives. Let me say also a few words on the third question for the panel, which I've taken to mean what would happen if one were to weaken the IP for COVID-19 specifically, given the urgency and so forth. So the conventional thinking in economics certainly would be that weakening intellectual property would, on the one hand, enhance access, but on the other hand, it would weaken incentives to innovate, for instance, in terms of vaccines for new variants. I would like to suggest that this conventional thinking is too simplistic. So first of all, if we look at the access side, I'd like to emphasize that vaccines are really different from therapeutic drugs. There is considerable tacit knowledge and know-how in the production process, and that's true both if you want to become the producer of any vaccine, And also, if you're only producing a vaccine and want to produce a new one, there's a lot of things that are not in the patent that you need to know in order to produce the vaccine. And in relation to that, it's important to keep in mind that there are not that many vaccine producers in developing countries, and many of those have actually chosen to enter cooperative technology transfer agreements with developed country producers even before COVID-19. Another aspect of this is that there is such a thing as a generic drug, of course, where one can say that the drug copy is chemically equivalent to the original, but for vaccines, it's not going to be exactly the same because it's more complex. And one may then need to do a copycat vaccine, might then have to go through clinical trials. So for these reasons, I'm quite doubtful that weakening intellectual property would make a big difference in terms of access. And we have, I think, here a situation that's quite different, but the one that prevailed for around HIV, for instance, 20 years ago, where patents were a much more important barrier to access relative to other things. Conversely, on what's my last slide on what would weakening IP do for innovation incentives. Of course, anything that lowers anticipated profit or increases risk is bad for innovation incentives. However, as I've shown you in the paper, the level of COVID-19 R&D that we observe is far above historical levels that we would expect. A lot of COVID-19 has been undertaken by public institutions or actors with no motivations, and we also see that early stage incentives may have played a role and they may counteract the effect of reduced market size. So I'm not sure either that weakening IP would necessarily be that bad in terms of innovation incentives. But I think if we want to broaden access to vaccines, including low and middle income countries, the issue is not so much the IP, it's other things that this panel will be discussing, including on export restrictions on raw ingredients for vaccines and so forth.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you again for keeping within the time limit. I think your paper sets up quite nicely a transition to Arjun Jayadev, who I suspect has a different view on the IP.
Yes, yes, I do. But
so please, Arjun, the floor is yours.
yes, so thanks very much for having me. Yes, so as I mean, I suppose what I'd like to start off with saying is that what I'm going to be presenting is a group of arguments that I think sort of have to keep on being revised in real time, as all of us have experienced, because this thing is moving so fast. But to keep it quite sharp, I believe broadly that the way that we manage the knowledge systems has worsened and will continue to worsen the pandemic. And let me start by saying the good news is, of course, science is succeeding. I think we should acknowledge and be very grateful for all the kind of things that science has done. I should also say it's not just the vaccines that we talk about from the West, but also, since we are talking in the WTO, also the vaccines that are there from the Chinese, the Russians, and so on. There really has been a quite incredible set of efforts. And as Patrick was suggesting, a lot of public effort into this as well. I think that however good or bad our systems were before the pandemic, I think what we can only say is, despite the magic of actually science succeeding, what we have right now is something that is very likely to tip into something that's both unjust and incompetent. And I would suggest this suboptimality in 4 areas. Patent protection and hoarding of know-how. I think that we should start really talking about these 2 things together, because that's really what we want to come into the knowledge commons and the way that when we talk about these things. Vaccine grabs by rich countries, differential treatment of vaccines by global authorities, and what we're seeing more commonly now, which is the use of vaccine distribution for shows of soft power, diplomacy, and so on, which may be somewhat suboptimal. So let me just quickly jump into patent rights and know-how more generally. I think it's very clear right from the outset that patent rights was hindering the fight against COVID, in the very early days, I don't know if you remember, there was the whole question about whether N95 masks could be produced. And then there was the question of treatments around COVID before the vaccine came into existence, treatments like remdesivir and others, in which there was running shortages in many countries because of patent protections and not having licenses and so on. So it's really not only a vaccine issue that we need to be thinking about in this complex of dealing with COVID. Of course, this was why the original call for CTAP last year and was rebuffed despite widespread effort. And I think it's hard to imagine why this should be the case, because to the extent that if we were able to generate open source knowledge in a effective way, who knows, we may have gotten here in a much healthier situation. In any case, we know that technologies for public health have massive spillover benefits. And I think that was an interesting episode in our management that we actually decided not to do that. And I think the fear was obviously making an exception in this case might be the thin end of the wedge, which would ultimately result in the collapse of rules to defend intellectual property. I think with respect to vaccines, I think as Patrick mentioned, and I think everybody knows, many companies receive significant subsidies. The estimates are around for about $100 billion. And in some cases, the entire primary cost in Moderna and others. And the AstraZeneca vaccine was developed in a publicly funded lab. I think what we have to remember is the case for IP blocking collapses in the case when the first copy cost is actually borne by the public. At that point of time, efficiency considerations suggest that you should price at marginal cost. And so it really makes no sense. Of course, we gave a patent monopoly on top of that, but there was no real case for that from an efficiency viewpoint and from a dynamic efficiency viewpoint. So obviously the argument now has shifted to saying that it's not the IP and it's productive capacities. And I think it's important to remember that productive capacities did not exist 8 months ago in developed countries. Of course, there's some tacit know-how and so on, but an enlightened policy like we've had in several instances would have transferred this know-how even before the final regulatory approval to accelerate production. If we knew and we had a good sense that this was going to work, a sort of global body which could actually manage the knowledge commons in a more effective way, ought to have tried to accelerate this. In any case, as an estimate of 3 to 4 months for scaling up of factories that people have come up with. And even now, current attempts at expansion, especially in developing countries, are being limited primarily because there's such a focus on developed countries and trying to establish scale up there. Of course, when you have a shortage, and Robert, you said the word was shortage, I think that's right. You're going to have a vaccine grab, and it's predictable. It's unfortunate that I feel sort of churlish saying this when Michael's going to speak next, but COVAX and Gavi were undercut by more lucrative bilateral agreements with developed countries. And of course, there are these two figures that are doing the rounds. 14% of the world's population have placed orders for about 85% of the entire estimated supply. More than 170 countries with a population 2.5 billion haven't received a shot. I wonder whether there was a missed opportunity by not doing advanced market commitments for non-Western vaccines, or I may have missed this, but I think this is a place where we could have actually seen some serious movement forward in actually expanding production. Now, I think, as Shabnam pointed out, delays in vaccinating the world as a result will cost, okay, maybe not millions, but certainly hundreds of thousands of lives. And it's not just a developed country or developing country problem. I think it's important to think, for example, of the case of Manaus, which seemed to have hit herd immunity, but immediately fell back. And you could see this actually undoing vaccine effectiveness, not just in developing, but developed countries. Of course, there's also the questions about approval processes, which are heavily skewed in favor of vaccines developed in the rich countries. I keep underlining this because we seem to think that there's only innovation in one area rather than another area, but many people, including in India, are getting vaccinated, hopefully by vaccines which are developed indigenously as well. And producers are using vaccine exports as shows of soft power. I believe other people in the panel may actually explain what are the kind of constraints to exports that are going on, but we can see this as being part of the political economy, if you will, of vaccines. So I'd just like to sort of end by saying that I still think that there are some ways forward which will help ramp up vaccine production. We are living in perhaps maybe the first global event that we've had ever as a species. And it seems problematic that we're not thinking about it as a global issue. So a global moratorium on IP or on monopoly control over vaccine technology, by which I mean including things like know-how, tacit knowledge, manufacturing capacities, and so on. If countries issue compulsory licensing, we should ensure that technological know-how is part of that. It would be good if the WHO worked with developing countries to work out regulatory approval tracks so that we could have, in some sense, trust in other vaccines. Of course, we needed like a Marshall Plan of a widespread global acceleration of manufacturing capacity and more flexible regulatory approvals. Now, for example, Defense Production Act example that people might know of with the Biden administration requiring Merck and J&J to work together is an example of the kind of thing that we would not have done had it not been for something this urgent. Otherwise, as I think Shabnam has mentioned, the pandemic lasts longer, it gets much more dangerous, and we have huge continuing economic, social, and health costs. So I hope that we will find a way for reworking our systems of managing the knowledge commons. Thanks.
Thank you, Arjun. And thanks again for efficient presentation. So we had quite different views, I think, between Patrick and Arjun on the role of intellectual property rights here. I think we should go right to Michael Kramer, for your views, recent papers you produced on trade and vaccines. Michael, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. My remarks today will draw on the work of a group of economists called Accelerating Health Technologies Group that have been researching ways of accelerating availability of vaccines for COVID-19. And this presentation will focus on trade implications, but I'll be drawing in part on a couple of articles that we published, one in Science that just came out, and another that's an NBR working paper that will be coming out in American Economic Review Papers and Proceedings, but also we'll be going off and focusing on trade issues. And thanks for the reference to advanced market commitments. Many of us in this group worked on the advanced market commitment for pneumococcus, and happy to in Q&A to discuss the similarities and differences. I do think there would be a role for advanced market commitments focused on a broader, much broader set of countries, but I won't be focusing on that today. Okay, let me start. I think in thinking about these issues, it's useful to start with just some technical characteristics of vaccine production. So one thing to note, and why we'll be going through this, partly thinking about the current pandemic, but partly thinking about what do we need to do to address the next pandemic. So first, most candidate vaccines fail in trials. We got extraordinarily lucky. If you start early stage, you could be thinking 5–10% chance of success. The fact that we had so many successes is fantastic. We put a lot of effort in and got some things right, but I also think we got a lot of things wrong. But without making that judgment, we also got lucky. Another thing to note is that vaccines are technically very different. They're biologicals. They're very different than small molecule drugs. Much harder to produce. The license is not for the product. It's actually for the process. So each factory gets separately licensed. And that's why, as we heard in the last presentation, it's not just a matter of IPR, it's a matter of a knowledge transfer. Factories are pretty expensive and they take a long time to build and repurpose. So there's very different short and long run supply elasticities. In the short run, there's a limit to what you can do. In the long run, you can do much more. There are also, of course, risks even after you get through the licensing. Even if the trials go well, you could have the production, the yield, the amount of vaccine that's produced by the factory could turn out to be much smaller than you think. You may have to optimize the production process. Europe's, unfortunately, been the subject to factories that haven't had the yield that they hoped for. And of course, then there's the risk you could have some side effect afterwards, and that could prevent continued distribution. One other thing to note is there are many different technological approaches or platforms. Of course, there's further differences even within these platforms. I've listed a few of them here. There tends to be specialization. Different firms are specialized in different approaches. Different countries are specialized in different approaches. Just as an example, US had some of these mRNA firms. China had some other technologies. We didn't know ex post. It turns out both worked. Fantastic. Ex ante, we didn't know which was going to work. Okay. Move on. Sorry, I'm having trouble moving my slides. Sorry. Okay, so given these, we can ask, what would a hypothetical benevolent social planner do? Well, one thing to note, which we've emphasized in the work of our group, is there are huge benefits to accelerating vaccine availability during the pandemic. If the world is losing $500 billion every month, WHO and IMF and other estimates, OECD estimates, and that's just the short-run GDP costs. That means if we could get a vaccine out faster, huge gains for the world. And the first presentation reflected that. So what would that imply for how a social planner would invest? Well, first you would invest at risk. You'd invest before the vaccine trials are done, even though there's a very high risk of failure. It's still worth it. Second, you want, I should have added this. You want it is there actually. You want very large capacity. You want very large capacity because the time to vaccinate people is the number of people who have to be vaccinated divided by the annual capacity. So bigger capacity, you can get everybody done, more quickly. There's also an equity benefit, by the way, I'll mention, because you speed up the most for the people at the end of the queue. If you cut the queue, the time in half, that's a small difference for people at the front of the queue. It's a big difference for people at the back. You also want many shots on goal. When we did analysis very early on, people say a lot's been invested, but we called for much larger investment just because you really want many shots on goal. We calculated optimal national investment for every country, but all countries would want to diversify across platforms. Let me come to the country analysis later. Let me think about this globally. You want to diversify across platforms because there's correlated risks. Obviously, you'd want productive efficiency. Whatever you decide to produce, you'd produce efficiently. That means, in part, you would use evolving information as you get data from trials, and you might repurpose things from one use to another. So we think to it, as we think to the next, so let me just pause or interrupt myself there. Productive efficiency probably means you're not going to have every country producing vaccines because there's many different platforms. Different countries are specialized in each. There's some economies of scale in production. Probably you're going to want a bunch of international trade, and thought that was very relevant for the WTO. In fact, I don't want to just say probably. Definitely, you're going to want this. This is you'd also, if we think to the next pandemic, it's going to be efficient to maintain idle capacity and stockpiles of intermediate inputs, because that's what's going to allow you to invest at very large scale in many different candidates to get many different shots on goal. And really what we don't have enough for the world right now, even though so many vaccines succeeded. If we'd been trying all these different vaccines and only one or two succeeded, then we would have wildly inadequate amounts. And you would have wanted to be able to bring more capacity online quickly. But so you would need the raw materials for that. You would need the intermediate inputs like bioreactors. Okay, let me move on. Okay, so that's what this hypothetical social planner would do. Now let me turn to what happens in equilibrium or whatever we've got now. I don't know whether to call it equilibrium. One thing I think that's very important to note is that there are important ethical, social, political constraints on vaccine pricing during a pandemic. Let me not talk about for now whether those are good or bad. I think there are plenty of good reasons for it, but just to argue that there's going to be very big distortions due to, there's a very big gap between the social value of vaccines and the price. We estimate the value of additional marginal capacity at $600 to $1,000 per course of vaccine. That dwarfs the $6 to $40 price per course observed in deals with vaccine producers. You know, companies are not charging the marginal value. They're charging much less than that right now. And that, now there are good reasons for that, but that does imply that from a purely commercial incentive, there'll be insufficient incentives for early capacity expansion, insufficient incentives for very large scale investment, and insufficient incentives to hold stockpiles, which may create a role for governments or public sector to do this. I would say does create a role. Okay, you know, here's one way to see this. I've drawn a simple supply and demand diagram. If you look at the blue curve, that might be short run supply. You can see that, you know, eventually we run out of capacity, and at that point the price starts to go way. The demand curve becomes the supply curve becomes inelastic. That's going to generate a high equilibrium price. You can see why countries might not want, and the global system might not want to accept that. A lot of that is going to be rents for producers. So you wind up with some sort of price cap. Okay, now that's, in this case, I think the companies sort of knew that if they tried to price at $500 a dose, they would run into this. So they just, you know, quasi-voluntarily price lower. What that means is that you've got shortages. You know, there's a lot of vaccine with a very high social value under that yellow curve, and but the, you know, price, you know, it's demand and supply are not equated. When you have shortages, people, or in this case countries, are going to want to grab supply, just as, you know, just as we heard. Who can grab supply? Well, you know, it's partly richer countries. It's partly countries that have the ability for various reasons to move faster. So just even thinking, you know, US and UK could move quickly. EU had to coordinate. US and UK wound up with a lot of supply. Okay. This also means there's very strong incentives for export bans. If you have a factory at home, well, this is extremely valuable vaccine. Why? And you're not going to, even if you cared about commercial things, you're not going to get the full value for that. So there's very strong incentives from a national level to put on an export ban. Okay, let me go on to the next slide. So there's strong incentives for export bans and for hoarding. I won't go through examples, but I think we see some behavior like that. I would argue surprisingly little. The international trade system has held up amazingly well, given the strength of incentives for change. Okay, the next step is, well, and let me note the key role that uncertainty plays. We could see failure. Why is the, I mean, I wish the US would release the AstraZeneca that we're holding on to, but why are we doing? Well, maybe we're worried something could go wrong, better play it safe. So anticipating that you might not be able to get, that other countries might have put on export bans, they might hoard. Countries naturally are thinking, well, we better focus on domestic production. And let me argue that is actually a potential disaster. If I don't mean the country shouldn't invest domestically, but what I mean by this is if the international trading system collapsed, that would be a disaster, because for many reasons, but even if countries were symmetric, the US, China, these very large countries, we do not we don't have capacity across all the different platforms. We can't. Every country, even the largest, is going to rely on international trade. And small countries, it's completely hopeless. This time, Australia invested a lot in domestic things and it didn't work out. But are we going to expect, even high-income small countries to do this? It's just not feasible. Add on to that, the supply chains are international. They're global supply chains for the inputs. So international trade is vital, and it's actually at risk. Okay. Okay. So what can we do about it? Well, one approach And I think if we go back to what the social planner would do, we might have globally centralized production and distribution. That would provide insurance. This particular epidemic hit a huge chunk of the world, but not every epidemic does. So you could have the capacity, and there's a big benefit of insurance. And obviously, even this pandemic is very uneven. You could allocate, a global social planner could allocate things to the places that need it the most. Okay, you could also do redistribution. You could allocate based on health need. You could fund based on ability to pay. Now, anytime you're trying to do insurance, you have to worry about moral hazard, adverse selection. I don't think those are minor issues. Would other countries that are using masks, are they going to want to share with the have allocations go to the countries that aren't using masks? Who knows? And maybe countries figure, well, we can control it, they can't, so why do we fund a centralized system? So I think there are issues there, but I think there are deeper issues. I think this is, unfortunately, look, I hope I'm wrong, but I think this is not going to be incentive compatible for high income countries. I don't think the key issue is the financial contributions. We've heard I think the key issue is there's very different nationally optimal investment plans. High income countries, it's nationally optimal from their standpoint to invest in many, many different candidates, even more shots on goal, even more capacity for each one. But most fundamentally, if you're going to have distribution based on health need, then that means that high income countries, and so the early COVAX proposals said, look, we're not going to give to one country. If they bought outside, we're going to allocate to the countries that need it the most. And everybody will have this 20% cap until we cover that, 20% of the population, so on. High income countries, I don't think this is just a Trump effect. I think that high income countries are going to, or any country that can get their population vaccinated is going to look for opportunities to do that. And countries might show some international solidarity. I don't think it's zero, but I think saying that they're going to have their citizens go later, that's very hard for a democratically elected politician to do. And the US current policy on AstraZeneca suggests this isn't just a Trump issue. Okay. So what is this? So I've painted a very pessimistic picture, very strong incentives for countries to do things like export bans or hoarding that are detrimental to other countries with the possible collapse of the international trade system. How do we address this? And so I would love it if we could, I would vote for us all giving tons of money to COVAX to run everything, but I don't think countries are going to surrender that much sovereignty. I think the key is to change the game that countries are playing. Not, let's make moral appeals, but in addition to that, we need to change the game. And that can be done by doing what there's reasons to do in any case, just from what the global social planner would do, is stockpile inputs, put in idle capacity for production of additional inputs and of the final good of the vaccines. That's something that, as I say, the social planner would do a lot of that, but it has the additional benefit that it reduces, if we can avoid the danger of shortages, then you reduce the danger of shortages, you reduce the incentives for each country to take these steps that hurt other countries through export bans or through hoarding. Now, how do you get that capacity in place? Well, given that there are limits on prices during pandemics, there's an actual real resource cost of maintaining these stockpiles, maintaining the idle factories. That's something you can't count on the private sector to do it if they rationally expect limits on pricing in the pandemic. That means we need either national or international funding to maintain the stockpiles, maintain the idle capacity. I would argue that you probably want a combination of the two. I think there's some countries are going to see this in their national interest to maintain these stockpiles, and that actually, in the short run, you might be hoarding supplies and buying things up. The long run, the supply capacity curve is much more elastic. So there, you're generating positive externalities for other countries to the extent that an individual country holds supplies. So we should encourage rich and middle, high income, middle income countries to go out and prepare for the next pandemic. That's in everybody's interest, but we also need global international efforts to make sure that there's also supplies for lower income countries as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Excellent way, I think, to try to square the circle between Patrick and Arjun's interventions, but they may have a different view on that. Let's now move to Sylvia Sreshku from OECD, who I think is going to give us a fairly granular look at the role of global supply chains and the vaccine production and trade facilitation in the manufacturing of and distribution of vaccines. Sylvia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bob. And it's really a pleasure as well and a privilege to be here with you today and share the floor with such distinguished panelists. And thank you very much as well to everyone attending. And I will also try to share my screen. Which, sorry, it worked a few minutes ago.
Okay, we'll get there.
Here it goes.
And there it is.
I hope you can all see it now.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So indeed, I will try to go through a recent paper that we did with colleagues at the OECD, Andrea Andronelli and Javier Lopez, looking into the trade interdependencies in vaccines. And first of all, I would also like to take a little look back at 2020, because we have seen these trade interdependencies to be really important, not only for vaccines as we do now, but also for many others COVID-19 related goods. And there was also some work that Andrea and Javier had done back in May 2020, looking at the demand and the shortages in some of these COVID-19 related goods. And what we were seeing at that time was that really demand and supply were highest for this COVID-19 related products, really in the worst hit places of countries experiencing increasing number of COVID-19 cases. So it really started to show a role for trade to respond to this increasing demand. What we were starting to see at the same time were some more unfortunate responses because of this shortages experienced by different countries in terms of export restrictions that started to be put in place. And this was the case not only for COVID-19 related goods, but also for other type of medical products that were not necessarily addressing COVID-19 directly, but countries in the midst of confusion and not knowing what goods would be needed to respond to the pandemic, started to impose this type of measures on them as well, from bans, quotas, or export licensing measures. But slowly, as the time went by and the emergency of the pandemic in place, we started to realize, I think, more what the trade interdependencies that we were talking about and that were in place. And just a quick takeaway from the graph here is that where you see the green cells being highlighted is really, it shows the trade in this COVID-19 related goods between G20 and other OECD economies. In COVID-19 related goods is that we have a two-way trade. So we have countries like Germany or China that import and export from each other these types of goods. So it's really showing how countries are interdependent in these types of goods. And while we saw export restrictions starting to be put in place at an earlier stage of the pandemic, slowly we also started to see and experience more trade facilitating measures. And we saw as well that with this increasing demand, trade and supply chains were able to respond and address shortages. And we can think of an example here in the case of Korea, for instance, who became one of the major exporters of COVID-19 tests, as it had experiences in producing and having supply chain for other types of tests, and it was able to reorient this manufacturing capacity to respond to a very increasing demand in that type of good. So where we are now, because we're talking, of course, more about the vaccines, as we have seen in the past presentations, this is an urgent thing to address, to respond to also, as we saw in the first presentation, to economic needs and then the need to address recovery in many sectors and in many countries. And as we have seen also from the past presentations, these vaccine supply chains are extremely complex. So again, just a snapshot here of how this vaccine supply chain would look from the discovery of the drug to its production, distribution, and administration. As we were seeing in the past presentation from Michael Kremer, we have different types of platforms and vaccines. So of course, the ingredients that need to go into these can be quite different, but it again really shows that it's not just about the final product, but it's also about all the inputs that come into one type of vaccines and the other types of items, ancillary equipment that are needed to administer it. So this makes again the case for supply chains. Manufacturing capacity for vaccines is not only complex, but is also concentrated. In the map here, we tried to get to data that it was very usefully collected by the Asian Development Bank in terms of the types of different manufacturers and distributors of vaccines that are present throughout the world. And what we can see just by plotting this on a map is that they are really concentrated in regions such as North America and Europe, and in some parts in Asia, but there are many parts of the world where the database does not record any of these manufacturers and distributors. So again, in order to respond to the demand for vaccines that of course comes from all countries around the world, it makes the case to use these supply chains and to scale up manufacturing, as again we were seeing in the previous presentation. We've used data from existing trade of vaccines, which of course doesn't include COVID-19 vaccines specifically, but it does allow us to see what kind of trade lanes are existing and what kind of infrastructure are in place, from who is exporting to who is importing. And just looking at exports of vaccines from 2018, we see that they are very much concentrated. So there are about 10 countries that amount to 93% of the global export value of vaccines. It's a bit lower in volumes, it's about 80%. And there are different rankings as well between who matters more in terms of value versus volume, which also gives insights that the unit prices, export unit prices differ across countries. We see less of the dispersion at the level of imports, which again makes us think that there is this specialization in the type of production of vaccines that countries have. We are seeing the same time of concentration, also looking at some firm level information. So we are using here an OECD database of some big manufacturers' affiliates around the world. And again, it matches what we were seeing in the prior map, is that really this potential manufacturing capacity appears to be concentrated in very few regions. And again, you can see that these are economies in the European Union, other countries in Europe, North America, China, India, and Brazil. While we have some affiliates present in other countries, but the bulk still remains present in this region. So again, in terms of how exchanges take place, it's really important for trade to play a role. And it's not just about the final product, but again, about all these different inputs and ancillary equipments that are needed in the production, distribution, and administration of vaccines. Again, just if we take the example of an input such as adjuvants, we can see that there are countries such as Mexico, China, Turkey, that account about 30% of exports using previous trade patterns data. But we also have countries as United States, they are a top exporter of syringes, Netherlands of dry ice that we needed for the cool storage, and so on for different other types of countries. So we have all these inputs coming from really different places around the world. And you need trade to function and supply chains to make sure that they reach the manufacturers who need to put these together, and then for the final administrations of vaccines. So based on this mapping of how current manufacturing capacity looks like, and that is not just about the final product, but it is also about the inputs that are being used to produce COVID-19 vaccines. We have tried to see what areas can matter in really keeping supply chains open and making sure that the trade can provide this environment that is conducive to broader vaccine distribution. So first of all, we looked at tariffs, and there are still tariffs on vaccines in many economies. We see that about 8% of them are still applying duties, about 5%. It's not just about the final products, but also about the inputs. We see a lot of tariffs still remaining there, which finally increase the price that you would get for a vaccine and the tools and items you need to administer it. So you still have tariffs remaining on vaccines ingredients, on the materials such as syringes, needles that you need to administer it, as well as for some of the primary packaging and distribution materials, which in this case can even go up as to around 12%. So one important area that we thought that deserves attention is really there is scope to reduce these tariffs where they remain. Second of all, and I think this again was mentioned throughout the different presentation, there is a lot of scope to continue mapping some of these regulatory requirements, processes, and approvals, as these can be quite different in different markets. So knowing which these are can help enable a more vaccine distribution. It's important to know which they are because they can be very complex. And again, we've looked at pharmaceutical products and some of the chemicals that go into them, and comparing with other sectors, these are two of the sectors which really face quite a high number of standards and regulations. So it's important to know which these regulations are in order to have a space of seeing how it is possible to streamline these types of measures. Third, avoiding export restrictions. I think this is one of the key questions set out for the seminar. And of course, again, through the looking at how the vaccine supply chain is constructed, it is really making a case to avoid applying this type of policy. As I was trying to show earlier in the slides, these types of export restrictions started to be put in place already for other types of COVID goods early on in 2020, and soon realized that it was not the good way to go to really increase the supply for some of these very urgent and needed goods throughout the world. So again here, because vaccine and input production is concentrated, applying export restrictions in one country will ultimately end up being an import restriction of another, because it's limiting the ability of countries that do not produce some of these inputs or final products to have access to them. At the very least, imposing these types of measures also implies cost in terms of time to fulfill, to see what they are and what exactly traders need to do in this case. And time is particularly crucial during this pandemic, as in any other crisis of this type. And of course, while initially they would be applied to increase availability for the domestic market in a short term, in the end, they would reduce incentives for domestic firms to increase production and invest in new capacity. And beyond this, there is also the risk of a cascade or domino effect. And again, this is something that we saw already in the early stages of the crisis, and there is always the risk to reproduce this with imposing these types of measures on vaccines as final products, or it's different inputs, applying them in one market, then could lead to this domino effect to being applied in others or throughout the supply chain, which could really increase costs and have also a negative impact in terms of time and reaching this kind of needed inputs. In terms of trade facilitation, to which you alluded, Bob, this is something that we have also looked at. It is really important, another really important element to look at, particularly as well when considering that many countries, developing countries, will have to import vaccines or related inputs. And again, it would be really important to increase cooperation at border between all the different types of agencies that have a responsibility in this sense, in order to streamline all these processes and ensure that there are the least bottlenecks possible. And it will not be just in relation to the public agencies that we see at the border, but also with some of the logistic operators that have to be present in this space. Again, we have seen many trade facilitating measures applied in the earlier stages of the pandemic. We have seen that this have helped with getting the different pharmaceuticals and medical goods where they were needed, and some of the experiences from them could be taken up in the case of the vaccines to see what worked best and how they could be applied as well in this case, or adjusted where needed. And finally, because of the concentration of the existing manufacturing capacity and seeing where the potential manufacturers of the inputs or of the final products are being located, we really think that we need more information sharing across the entire vaccine value chains. I think we have seen at different moments in the news where some of the big manufacturers were trying to see how and in which ways it could expand their production, including through licensing agreements types. And it seemed really hard to find at moments to identify potential manufacturers and other firms to connect with. As I was trying to show in the earlier map, a very useful exercise has been done in this sense by the Asian Development Bank, and probably platforms such as this could be really useful to scale up, to allow the different actors to connect in the supply chain and ultimately support scaling up production and distribution via trade channels and different countries. So I will stop here and thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward as well to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. So we had a more granular view there of what's happening in terms of supply chains. We've had a lot of information put on the table here. I would like to put a pitch in for the WTO COVID-19 website. It's got lots of useful information on it, particularly around how WTO agreements actually work. Many people, I think, don't really fully understand how WTO agreements work. We also have very good information on things like trade and medical products, and we have data there that shows you how trade and medical products have helped solve part of the challenges and shortages around domestic treatment of the medical challenges. One thing I think that would be very useful, and Sylvia touched on this, is I think it's very difficult to get a sense of what the total supply and use situation is for vaccines globally. I used to work in agriculture years ago in the lead up to the Uruguay round, and one of our core elements was to have supply use tables for agricultural products. I then went to work for a US government agency where we often built supply use tables for different industries to help answer policymakers' questions. And this seemed to be the argument that the EU is using around its latest trade, its export-related policy, where it was basically saying we don't understand what's happening with domestic production versus exports versus domestic consumption. So I think some sort of trusted source that brings all that data together and provides on vaccines, vaccine components, on other medical related goods would be very helpful to help global policymakers have some confidence that they understand what's happening in the global situation. And they probably make better decisions. To do that, though, we'd need better practical things like if you look up vaccines in the various tariff schedules, you'll find out that they don't break out COVID-19 vaccines frequently. They'll just have a broad category called vaccines, and finding out the different subcomponents is very difficult also. So encouraging WCO and producers and consumers to start tracking at a more granular level will help improve the quality of information going into the market. Okay, I want to get to sort of bigger picture. We heard Shebnem and Sylvia give us talk about the interconnectedness. I think we heard Patrick, Arjun, and Michael sort of talk about market structure and incentives for production. So I think we've had very good detail about interconnectedness, but then also what's the incentive structure for creating a better response? Now, there's the pressing need of COVID-19. Much of what Michael said was looking forward. I think Arjun was also thinking, not just now, but looking forward, and Patrick also. And I think that's really important that we realize that, Michael, you were wondering if this is an equilibrium. I'd call it market conditions right now for COVID-19, right? So we've got this set of market conditions. We need to do everything we can, the levers that we can pull in the short term, which I think trade policy is helpful there. But there are other things government can do to facilitate the smoother distribution and production of COVID-19 vaccines, not necessarily related to the big picture of what's the long-term solution and what's the appropriate intellectual property environment. But it seems to me we've learned from, or at least manufacturers may have learned from the previous challenges around AIDS antivirals. But one thing we haven't talked about is sort of the sociology or psychology here. So, and that's related to people. There's some people who don't want to take vaccines. But governments knew about these kinds of challenges, Michael, right? I mean, governments have faced this kind of thing before, not on this scale. And maybe they took some steps to trying to solve the problem by building stocks and maybe sustaining some vaccine production, but they didn't sustain it. So we've got two sides of the, we've got governments, producers, and consumers. There's economics working in there, but there's also sociology, psychology, and political science. I'm not asking you guys to answer all those questions, but I do think it's important as we think about the economics that we just laid out here, that there's actual people making decisions behind the scenes here that may not follow what our economic models say. All right, I'm sorry, went on too long there. There are a couple of questions in the chat, but let me ask the presenters any pressing questions you'd like to ask one another. Arjun, do you want to ask Michael or Patrick any questions about their views on the role of IP and market structure?
Sure, maybe I can just,
or even respond.
Sort of, so maybe just make a sort of pitch and see whether it holds. I think that the way that we've conceived of the knowledge system, let's say the knowledge management system, is really the reason why we have patents and so on is that we hope that we're going to be able to bring in knowledge into the global pool. So we allow for a monopoly, which as economists in general you're taught to hate, for a bit to allow for that kind of system. Now my question is that really, whenever this has happened now in the recent past, people say IP is not the problem, it's data exclusivity. In earlier places, there's another sort of limitation, which was of data. Now the question is about manufacturing and technological know-how. So my question is, should we be thinking of the bundle of rights that we develop in the knowledge system to really be including all of these when we say that something has been developed. And if we do that, then we get away from these kind of questions. So I just wanted to pose that as a wrong turn in the way that we think about things.
Okay, I saw Michael, you nodding. Do you have a reaction to that?
Yeah, I do think that something, I do think that it would be good to create, I feel like a lot of these debates over IP, they pit two very important things against each other. One is the R&D incentives, which are, I think, very important, but the other is access, and that's obviously vitally important as well. And when you're just restricting things to debating IP, you're putting two very important things against each other, and more of one means less of the other at some level. But I think if we expand the space of instruments, we can do more. And in particular, if we create if we can find ways to reward R&D or stimulate R&D that don't restrict access as much, that's very valuable. Now, for some products, for small molecules, really IP might be the key thing. For vaccines, exactly as Arjun's saying, it's more than that. But then how could you do that? Well, advanced market commitments came up before. If you said, we're going to reward firms, but we're going to reward, for developing vaccine, I don't want to claim there's a complete plan on this, but if you said, well, reward firms for developing vaccines, but we reward them, A, if the vaccines meet certain technical standards, and then B, we reward them based on how many doses go in arms. Well, then it suddenly becomes in the interest of the vaccine developer. Imagine it's a company that itself has very limited capacity, but in No Serum Institute has huge amounts of capacity. Well, they would have every incentive to go to Serum, not just for moral reasons, but for commercial reasons, to go to Serum Institute or wherever, all around the world, to say, hey, let's actually not just release the IP because we have to, but actually actively cooperate. It's hard to in a regulatory way force knowledge transfer. Are you going to send your best scientists, or are you going to send your worst scientists? Especially when you want your best scientists at home working on your factory. Well, you have, if they're getting paid based in part on not just their own production, but Serum Institute's production, then they'll have incentives to effectively transfer the knowledge as well.
Thank you, Michael. Arjun?
Michael.
Patrick, what I've just heard there sounds almost like mission-oriented government incentive structures. And yet in one of your papers, you suggest that's an inappropriate solution to this problem. Do you have a reaction to that? And if I mischaracterized your paper, please accept my apologies.
Well, I think in that part of the paper, it was more the views of my co-author. So I don't really have a strong view on that, right? But maybe let me add a comment, but I think that you have been trying to kind of present Arjun and my arguments as contradicting, but actually I would say not that much, because what I was saying is if you just weaken the patent and you don't do anything around the basic knowledge and so forth, that's not going to change much. Now, if you're thinking about a bundle, I think that's the right thing to think about it. Then compulsory licensing around that, I think, is really uncharted territory, both from the legal, economic perspective and technically. And so, as Professor Kramer was alluding to. So I'm not quite sure how that would work, but yes, we need to think about all these things kind of together. One thought is that a lot of the research on COVID was done by public institutions. And for a public institution, it might make sense to think we're going to license this out to a manufacturer, but we want this to be widely available in developing countries. So I think kind of public institutions in developed countries can also help kind of facilitate access down the line through the licensing contracts and so forth.
Any other comments or reactions?
Let me just answer your question, Bob, if
Sure, please, yes.
I may. So this is important because when we think about these, trade relationships, and when a large country like US does a lot of stimulus, we always immediately jump to the conclusion this is very good for the rest of the world. This is not going to apply in the short run, and also in this case, because there are two other things here. One is the financial channel, right? US stimulus is not just means Mexico can sell more avocados to US, but it's also capital flows is going from US to Mexico, and that can create a lot of domestic financial stability issues there, which Mexican government needs to handle, right? So the financial channel of spillovers. And then second, we are still in a pandemic. There is still a health shock, right? On top of the fiscal shock, financial shock, and the trade shock, there's still a health shock. So the other countries has to produce the goods to send to you. And here's the importance of the global IO linkages and production network coming together with the trade network, right? So the other countries need to produce to sell you the goods, and they also need to demand to buy goods from you. So basically it goes both ways. And if the other countries are in recession, that means US cannot sell. And if the other countries also have sick workers, that means the other countries cannot produce so that US can buy, right? So, and that's exactly at the heart of our paper, because this says in the short run, elasticities are very low and the production is Leontiev. And that's exactly actually how you guys talk about the vaccine production, right? I mean, when all of you presented, okay, so I need this ingredient and that is going to come from here and that's why it is hard to immediately scale up the vaccine production. The same thing with everything else outside vaccines, right? I mean, in the short run, we are talking about Leontiev productions with fixed prices, which means prices are not going to adjust immediately. You have strong complementarity, and you are not getting, your inputs from everywhere in the world, and you just cannot simply switch to China. You cannot just say, okay, I'm getting steel from Brazil as a US contractor in the construction sector. So Brazil is sick, but China is not sick. I'm going to switch to China. That's not going to work in the next 6 to 8 months, okay? And that's going to be the case that you have these economic costs in trillions. What COVAX needs is 37 billion. So literally, this is a very important difference, and advanced countries need to understand that it is in their best interest. I mean, we don't even have to, figure out if it is the private sector incentive or the government sector incentive. This is in best interest of advanced countries right now to invest in initiatives like COVAX. I mean, because the cost that they are going to suffer from the disruption in the global production and trade is going to be in trillions. Thank you.
Thanks, Shebnem. Michael has to leave in about 5 minutes, but I have a question for you from one of my colleagues. How do you think international stockpiling and spare capacity could be organized out to make international instead of national stockpiling incentive compatible? Do you have reactions to that?
Yeah. So I think we probably need a mixture of international and national stockpiling. I think international stockpiling is good, is better, but national stockpiling will have positive effects as well. Unless it's if it's substituted for the international, then that's not as good. But I think higher income countries are going to naturally be able to set aside more for emergencies, and so they will want to maintain the optimal level of stockpiles from a purely national standpoint. It's going to be higher for a higher income country than for a low income country. That's not from a moral standpoint, but from a self-interest standpoint, that would probably be true. So I don't think we should, if the high income countries want to have excess stockpiles, that's fine. That's good for other countries. But we do need a basic level of stockpiles globally. And then, if you did say, look, we wanted to make it just have international stockpiles, how would you do that? I think you have to convince people that that they're not going to be subject to export bans. Maybe you could do that by locating them in small countries, Singapore. They're not going to put on, if they take enough for Singapore, there's still plenty for other countries. They also may have an incentive to keep a reputation for abiding by international agreements. So that might be one thing that could help. You could also say that you have some rights depending on how much you paid in, as well as some rights for, just by virtue of being a human being and getting something. So that would tend to make it, more incentive compatible, but less equitable. So there's just, have to see how far you can, how much equity we can get in a way that actually countries, the high income countries, will put the money in for.
Thanks, Michael. And I understand you have to go. Thanks for joining us. Very much appreciated your contribution. Does anybody else want to respond to that question? We heard Michael's answer. Shabnam?
I want to add, I fully agree with Michael, and I want to add the role of multilateral institutions here, right? I mean, this has to be the moment that really multilateral institutions, WTO, WHO, IMF, World Bank, G20, these institutions has to be at the forefront of this, right? I mean, we have to look at it as a multilateral solution. I mean, we are in a globalized world. Globalization amplified the pandemic. We are talking about a virus traveling, but at the same time, it is the only solution. So it's not going to be the job of US government alone or the Europeans and whatnot. I mean, the multilateral institutions, all of them has to take the front stage here. And then G20 should be the place. Somehow this has to be sorted out, this combination of national and international and how you do it. But I don't think we can do it without the involvement in both the G20 governments and the multilateral institutions, because the approach has to be a multilateral one.
Of course, I like that idea. Sylvia, please, yes.
I just wanted to quickly add to that very good point, because yes, international cooperation, I think, will indeed be essential. And on top of that, also, I think public and private, more cooperation between them, because obviously the question of stockpiling is extremely complicated once you start thinking about what to stockpile, which product, which ingredient, will it be the final product? We have seen throughout COVID, how we started needing new products that we didn't think a couple of months back that we needed. So I think it would really require much more public-private cooperation in terms of looking what are the bottlenecks in the supply chain and how responses and risk management can come up in crisis like we're seeing now, and who knows what types of shocks we'll continue to face. And in terms of the private sector, we've talked a lot with businesses as well and pharmaceutical companies. It's how they've experienced the crisis, and one of the points that they made is that their own risk management strategies, as they have themselves learned a lot in the aftermath of the financial crisis, for instance, and then the way that they operate their own supply chains with COVID hitting different regions at different moments. It actually allowed them to move some of these ingredients to where they were needed at a specific time. So again, it shows that you do need trades, you do need to keep supply chains working and open, so as to be able to respond to where the crisis is happening.
So let me put in a pitch for the fact I mentioned that trade in medical goods, trade in foods also been fairly sustained, been very helpful solution to some of the challenges that we face here. And it's been very critical to the flow of these parts and components that are needed to produce these things. But it is members. So you mentioned, Shabnam, that it's multilateral institutions. For anybody who's worked in a multilateral institution, an institution like the WTO or OECD is very member focused. But I will say this, it seems to me the private sector has been learning. When I first saw the prices for vaccines, I was like, wow, that was pretty strategic on their part. Obviously, there's more that can be done, but getting countries to be more like-minded in trying to find global solutions and multilateral cooperation, I think it's easy to say, it's hard to do. So we do need to find a way. G20, I think, Shabnam, can be a place that can bring the political, potentially the political will there. I don't see a lot. But it would be good. Patrick, you raised your hand. And Patrick, we're at end time. You get the last word, my friend.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I just want to say, when we think about preparing for the next pandemic, another aspect of this is investment in basic science. For instance, the PCR that's underlying the test is coming from basic science of the 80s. And so continued investment in basic science is really a good preparedness, because we don't even know if vaccines will be the solution to the next pandemic. And I can see some dangers there. For instance, research in the US and UK to an extent that's cross-subsidized by fees from Asian students to a large extent. And meanwhile, in the future, we could be talking about a budget crunch in rich countries. So we could see research being squeezed out at a time when we need it more than ever to be ready for future pandemic, as well as to restart kind of innovation more generally.
I said you'd have the password. I dissembled a little bit. You brought up a point I wrote a note on, and that is post-pandemic, countries are going to be in very difficult debt circumstances, even very rich ones. And, most of my career has been under an environment of what I would call, what's the word I'm looking for, austerity. And if you look actually at US government R&D as a share of overall R&D, it's dropped quite a bit as a share of overall R&D. So will governments be in the position to support that kind of research going forward? And will they be in a position to support the kind of production, maintaining the production facilities and stockpiling and supplies that we seem to have agreed upon as an important solution? Right, thank you. I think we do need to go. So thank you very, very much. Excellent presentations, much appreciated. And have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are.